do. But I'm actually optimistic that we can fix this problem in America now. But we can do this, and you can do this.
Migrant populations build cities, build empires, and build communities. It's criminal to separate families. It's criminal to send the kids back to Mexico and the parents staying here.
You can't have journalism without mistakes. You will have mistakes. If a mistake is disqualifying, if a mistake means you never trust the media again, then we're doomed.
No matter how many facts we put forward, there is a portion of the country that simply isn't listening and isn't going to believe us. I think that we are a country that is fragmenting and that is fracturing along some fault lines that are deep and that are racial and that we're not confronting. And I think the one thing I would love for journalism to do is to confront that.
Era, this is race in America.
She is a woman who's multi-talented and incredibly energetic, an iconic feminist who's been dubbed the mother of feminism. Please welcome Ms. Gloria Steinem.
So I think we deeply understand there is no such thing as combating sexism without also combating racism, and no such thing as combating racism without also combating sexism, because they are so deeply, deeply intertwined.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I'm Jerry Herron, Dean of the Irvin D. Reed Honors College, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary. The Honors College is one of the sponsoring partners with FOCIS of today's program, along with Greater Detroit Association, Phi Beta Kappa Society, the Mark Illiers School of Business, the Journalism Institute for Media Diversity, and the Wayne State University Police Department. We're ready to begin today's FOCIS program, the fifth in the series on this 10th anniversary of both FOCIS and the Applebaum Chair in Community Engagement. This anniversary theme is What in the World is Going On? And today's topic is national security. I ask that you please take your seats and put your cell phones on silent. Thank you. Now, please join me in welcoming Director of FOCIS and holder of the Applebaum Chair, President Emeritus, Dr. Irvin D. Reed.
Thank you very much, Jerry. As the Director of FOCIS, I'm very pleased to have you here on the fifth program in this 10th anniversary celebration of FOCIS and the Applebaum Chair. On January 26th of this year, by the way, this is also the anniversary of the chair itself, but on the 26th of this year, Wayne State University President M. Roy Wilson formally inaugurated a year-long observance recognizing 150 years of the universities offering higher education both locally and internationally to men and women from around the world. And so FOCIS and the Applebaum Chair are very proud to be a part of the sesquicentennial, a word which I will not repeat for obvious reasons. It is a challenge indeed. Nearly 21 years ago now that I met Wayne State alumnus program's benefactor, Eugene Applebaum. He joined in this vision to bring to the campus high-level lecture series to enhance the role of the university in the life of this city. Regrettably, Gene passed away in December of last year. His absence is keenly felt, especially during these FOCIS programs, which he inspired and helped us to build over the past decade. He remained engaged throughout, and he and I discussed future programs at our very last meeting. And he was very involved, particularly in planning this program, and had planned to host a breakfast meeting earlier today, which his family and the foundation proceeded to do, and our special guest speaker today participated at that breakfast. So now with the role of bringing greetings on behalf of the entire university, I'm pleased to ask Governor Nicholson to come forward and to address you. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming him.
Hello, Warriors. It's nice to see some friendly faces in the audience for this special day. On behalf of the Board of Governors, my name is David Nicholson. I'm Vice Chair of the Board of Governors. And on behalf of the Board of Governors, the faculty, staff, and the students, I'd like to welcome you to Wayne State University and the second program of the 2018 In Focus 10th Anniversary Lecture Series. I'd like to extend a special warm greeting to both our moderators and our special guest, General David Petraeus. We have another important person in the House. I'd like to also recognize my chairman of the Board of Governors, Sandra Hughes O'Brien, who's sitting right here. He works very hard for all the Wayne State. So just a moment. The form of contemporary issues in society has a long and distinguished history at Wayne State. The university has been proud to host this series, not least because FOCIS embodies one of Wayne State's primary missions, which is dialogue. This type of presentation encourages dialogue across the many communities Wayne State serves. As a major research institution with local, national, and international outreach, Wayne State also shares the FOCIS series commitment to diversity, both in our faculty and our student body. As part of the 10th anniversary celebration, I'd like to take a moment to especially honor Eugene Applebaum. Mr. Applebaum was incredibly generous to the city of Detroit, his community. He shared a lot with all of us. But one thing he did do was make sure this series and brought us this series. And, it bears his name, and we can't say enough for all the things he did for Wayne State University and the greater Detroit community. We are, as I say, we are much in debt and will miss him greatly. The life of any great university is based upon providing an environment for free expression and open debate, qualities that also should characterize our interaction with the broader community. The Forum on Contemporary Issues in Society fulfills this goal in extraordinary ways. I salute Dr. Reed, his staff, and many guests he has welcomed during FOCIS decade of bringing dialogue, information, and inspiration to all of us. I am pleased to be part of today's special event and wish each of you a memorable experience this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Governor Nicholson. During the 10 years FOCIS has been in existence, hardly a week has passed without some act that has threatened the security of Americans or people of other nations. 3 years ago, we at FOCIS had the pleasure of hosting retired General Wesley Clark to address us on the topic of national security. And when I told General Patraeus that he was the second general to address the series, in the true style of a general, he said, "How many people registered for General Clark's presentation?" I mentioned to him that there were more than 800 people registered for this program today, which is among the top in the entire, and I think you should applaud yourself for your interest in national security. And so when I told General Petraeus that there were around 400 people registered for Wesley Clark, there was a very broad smile on his face. He will explain to you why a bit later on. As I said, we have rarely repeated a program, but the ever-present threat, both internationally and domestically, seemed to warrant a closer examination and analysis. For today's program, we have the assistance of two well-known members of the local print and broadcast community to serve as moderators for the discussion that will follow General Petraeus' presentation. Carol Crain is that most accomplished journalist, one who has made successful careers in both broadcast and print media. She has received 9 Emmys for her work as senior producer and host of Michigan Matters, a weekly program on Detroit's CBS TV 62. Her print credentials also include stints at the Toledo Blade, the Detroit News, the United Press International. Regular viewers of Detroit's WXYZ TV, Channel 7, know Truck Stokes as moderator and producer of Spotlight on the News, Michigan's longest-running weekly news and public affairs show. Chuck's many awards include 12 Emmys for editorial reporting and 2 Emmys for documentary reporting. He also received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Detroit chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists and is a member of the Michigan Association of Broadcasters. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming and thanking them for being here today, and I'd like to ask them to stand. Thank you, and you will hear more from them later. And I'm very delighted to tell you that out of a very busy schedule that he has all over campus today and throughout the evening, I suppose, President Wilson has just joined us, and I'd like to welcome him as well. Thank you. "157 years ago today, April 12th, 1861, troops under the Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Thus began the Civil War, the most destructive war in our nation's history, and the first and most urgent threat to America's national security. Nowadays, most Americans probably consider that the first real terrorist strike on American soil took place with the horrific attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. Americans of a certain age, however, will remember an earlier act of terrorism, the bombing of April 19, 1995, by Timothy McVeigh at the Alfred Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City, in which 168 Americans died. Those two examples describe the horns of our present dilemma. We face both the depredations of extremist acts associated with radical religious or political groups from abroad, and terrorist acts by American citizens associated with a variety of fanaticism or alienation. The power of radical extremist groups may have been broken on the battlefield, but its soldiers and sympathizers have dispersed throughout the world. Since September 11th, attacks in the United States, groups of individuals, many claiming allegiance or to religious sect or another group, have become the largest terrorist threats facing Europe and Africa. Beginning in 2015, terrorist attacks have caused death and destructions in nations including France, Spain, United Kingdom, Germany, Sweden, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria, and elsewhere. We Americans have had many reasons to be anxious about international travel, but the home front is as dangerous or more so. We have endured so much terrorism against Americans and American children, most of our own disgruntled or mentally impaired citizens causing them, that we have often remembered attacks only by where they occurred: Boston, Charleston, Newtown, Las Vegas, Orlando, Manhattan, and Parkland. Those are only some of the places within our borders affected by what might be regarded as terrorism. We have a speaker with us today who could really educate us on what is going on, whether it is cybersecurity or terrorism. He's a graduate with distinction from the United States Military Academy. General Petraeus is the only person in the history of the U.S. Army to be graduate in both the Army's Ranger School and the year-long U.S. Army Command and General Staff College course. He also earned a PhD in an interdisciplinary program in international relations and economics from Princeton, and later completed a fellowship at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. In 2007, General Petraeus was appointed by President George W. Bush to head multinational forces in Iraq. He subsequently was Commander-in-Chief of the United States Central Command and Commander of the U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan. His military career culminated with 6 consecutive commands as a general officer, 5 of which were in combat, a record unmatched in post-World War II era. For his military service and accomplishments, General Petraeus received medals including 4 awards of the Defense Distinguished Medal, the Bronze Star Medal for Valor, the Combat Action Badge, and Master Parachutist Wings. After retirement from the military, General Petraeus served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's now a partner with the global investment firm of KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute. Previously a visiting professor of public policy at the City University of New York, he's now a professor at the University of Southern California, a senior fellow at Harvard University, co-chairman of the Global Advisory Council of the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, and a member of numerous other service organizations and institutes. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and personal pleasure to ask you to join me in welcoming General David Petraeus. See, I'm very excited about his being here.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind welcome. Thanks for the kind introduction, President Emeritus. Thanks to the President for also being with us here this morning. It is great to be back in Detroit. I've not been here in a number of years, and I can say it with true sincerity that it is great to be back, to see the resurgence of a city that really hit rock bottom like the phoenix rising from the ashes, and to congratulate all of you on what you have done here. This is a city that has about as many cranes and construction projects as Dubai did back in the days when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, and it is quite remarkable to see what can happen when people pull together and determine how to move forward with an initiative that rescues a community of such importance to our country. It's wonderful to be here at Wayne State as you celebrate your 150th anniversary. Again, a great university surrounded by a great city. And it's very kind of you to mention the number of people who registered for this relative to the number who registered for my old boss, Wes Clark's. I'm not at all competitive, as you might understand. But I'll be sure to relate that to him. I mentioned to the President Emeritus earlier that he and I have a distinction that we share, which is that we're the only 2 captains in Army history who were #1 in the Command and General Staff College course. There generally weren't many captains that went, which is one of the reasons they're normally majors. And happily now they've mandated that you have to be a major before you can go to the Command and General Staff College, so our record is safe. And we will share that proudly. Look, I was asked to talk about the state of the world and the state of the United States and all of the rest of that. And so what I'm going to do before I sit down with the 2 journalists who have been introduced, and I note that the journalists outnumber the speaker in this particular panel, usually the other way around. But I'm going to talk about 3 topics. The first is the so-called return of history and an era of renewed great power rivalries, which is the most important concept about the strategic context in which we're currently located. Second, I want to talk about the 6 major threats to U.S. security. And then third, I want to talk about 5 lessons that I believe we should have learned from the wars of the past 16 years with Islamist extremists. Then I'll sit down and submit myself to the interrogation of the journalists. They have assured me there will be no enhanced interrogation techniques. I have opposed those, in all seriousness I have, for 2 big reasons. One is that they violate international law. The second is that they don't work. Beyond that, they're fantastic. The return of history. What am I talking about here? Well, back in 1989, around the end of the Cold War, a noted political scientist named Francis Fukuyama, who's out at Stanford University. In fact, I was out there this past week. By the way, the reason I have the coffee cup is that I flew in at 4:15 this morning from the West Coast on a red eye, which I have always vowed I would never fly again, but I ended up flying. And so if you see me sipping from time to time, it's to try to accelerate the process of my body getting from West Coast time to East Coast time. The return of history. He wrote about, in an article originally, and then a book, that was titled The End of History. And what he was referring to was that the dialectic, the dialogue, the competition, an intellectual discussion between 2 competing systems, that of the US and the Western democracies of the world and the Soviet system, that was over. And we won. The debate was finished. It was the end of history in terms of this, again, Hegelian dialectic. That lasted for about 25 years. During that time, the United States stood preeminent astride the globe, the world's only superpower, our system clearly having prevailed, clearly having proven its value and its worth, and its supremacy over any other system. Then, however, came the rise of China, a very rapid rise, a country that did something no other country has ever done in history, 2 decades straight of double-digit GDP growth year on year, with maybe one exception in there around the Great Recession, a truly extraordinary accomplishment. And now history is back. We are in an era of renewed great power rivalries. The big rivalry, of course, is the strategic competition between China and the United States. This can be mutually beneficial in some cases. It's very different from the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the Soviet system and that of the West, because, of course, the US and China are each other's #1 trading partners, as well as #1 strategic competitor. So this is a strategic situation that has to be managed. It is a competition that does have to be very carefully tended with dialogue and discussion and all the rest, even as there are occasionally issues such as those surrounding trade, surrounding the South China Sea, surrounding North Korea, etc., in which one or the other side expresses some deep concern. But this is an extraordinary change from a situation in which we were preeminent and our system stood unchallenged, because our system now is being challenged by, again, the Chinese system. It may not have all of the freedoms that we cherish, that some of us have indeed fought to protect. It may not have all of the transparency and openness and debate and discussion and so forth, which again we generally cherish, although sometimes it can get a bit noisy and cacophonous in Washington. Regardless, this is a new competition, and it is the most significant element of the new strategic context in which we find ourselves, and we have to recognize that, and we have to keep that in mind in all that we do. It is not just, of course, the rise of China It is also the resurgence of Russia, or really the resurgence of Putin's Russia. It is the beginning of the rise of India, perhaps of Brazil, some other great powers, the, again, recovery of Europe. But really, it is about the United States and China. And again, that is a relationship that we must get right. It was described very effectively in a book by Graham Allison, a professor at Harvard, where, as you mentioned, I'm a senior fellow. It was titled, "Destined for War, no question mark, colon, can China and the United States avoid the Thucydides Trap?" And this is really referring to the Peloponnesian War, which Thucydides chronicled, which described Sparta at the top, the established power, Athens, the rising power, i.e. US and China, and Thucydides wrote, inevitably, they went to war. And the question that Professor Allison examines is whether or not it is inevitable. And of course, the consequences would be far more disastrous today even than they were then, and in many of the other cases that he studies in his book, because we are obviously in a nuclear age. So this is, again, a very significant new reality that we must be very conscious of in all that we do. Second, I want to identify the major threats that our country and the countries of the Western world generally face. First, to come back to China to a degree, is the challenge of revisionist powers. These are countries that are not satisfied with the status quo. They want a change. It's countries like China, in fact, that does want to assert itself more fully on the world stage. It is Russia, which would obviously like to regain as much of the former Soviet Union, or at least the Russian Empire, as Putin can possibly make happen. It's Iran, which would like to establish the Shia crescent and achieve hegemony over at least the Shia areas of the Middle East, if not more. And it's North Korea, of course, which is seeking nuclear weapons that could hold US cities hostage. They're not satisfied with the status quo. They are willing to push the envelope to achieve what it is they would like to see done. Second, Islamist extremists. As was referred to, this is a battle that has been going on for some time. It really predates the 9/11 attacks, although that was clearly the event that solidified in our mind the magnitude of the threat that these extremists pose to the Western world, but even more so, arguably, to their own world, because this is, as I'll mention later, more a fight within the Islamic world. It's a fight for the heart of the Muslim world, even more than it is a fight between the Muslim world and other worlds. But it is a very, very serious threat. It is one that, when we have taken our eye off it, comes back, and I'll explain the lessons that I think we should have learned from the last 16 or 17 years of war with these extremists. There are ever more diabolically clever and challenging and dangerous cyber threats. There are those posed by nation states, Russia, trying to undermine our faith in democracy, to put a finger on the scales of an election, and not just to do that in the United States, but in other Western countries as well, and to actually do damage in some cases with their cyber capabilities, shutting down the electrical grid of a portion of the Ukraine, or a massive denial of service attack on Estonia. Actually, Estonia, it is the leading country in the world when it comes to e-governance. It is China stealing intellectual property, gathering information that can be used for counterintelligence activities. It's North Korea trying to intimidate movie producers who are going to say something unkind about the Hermit Kingdom. It's Iran doing enormous damage to Aramco, Saudi Aramco computers, 35,000 of them, and on and on. Many nation states employing new cyber capabilities in very threatening ways and posing even more threats, because we know it's publicly been announced that some of these countries have been inside our electrical grid industrial control systems. They have conducted cyber reconnaissance, and they are ready, if need be, in time of conflict, to try to shut down some of our most important infrastructure. There are cyber criminals who are, again, getting ever more clever and more diabolically inventive and ingenious about how they can steal data and then use it to make money. And again, some nation states do this as well, North Korea prominently among them, but it is criminal networks that are taking our data, putting it for sale on the dark web, and using it in a variety of different ways that all undermine various elements of our economy. And then finally, the group I'm most worried about in the cyber realm, extremists, once again, particularly those who are willing to blow themselves up on the battlefield to take us with them, to conduct suicide attacks, because I don't know how you deter an enemy who is willing to take his own life to take our lives at the same time. What keeps that individual from hitting the send key if he can get the equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction, a cyber WMD, again, perhaps the ability to shut down the electrical grid of the eastern United States and keep it down for weeks, maybe even months. A very, very scary threat. There is increasing domestic populism in many of the Western countries. Arguably, we saw some of that in our own presidential election. It was certainly present in the Brexit vote in the UK. We saw it in Germany, where the vote for the very hard right-wing party in response to the immigration the refugees that Chancellor Merkel accepted showed, again, an unfriendly or even ugly face, but one that did reflect real fears and real concerns. We saw it in France, where President Macron did, in fact, win and is now pursuing a variety of very important reforms, but we overlooked the fact that Marine Le Pen, again, a hard right candidate, actually got 35% of the vote there. We saw it in the Netherlands election. We certainly have seen it in Italy, which may not even be able to form a government because of how split that electorate has become. This is a concern. It is, if you look at the democracies of the world, affecting many of them, and doing it again in this context that I described up front, a context in which there is a new competition between the Western democracies, the so-called liberal democracies of the world, free market economics and so forth, and the system that is being established by China. There's also unprecedented amount of strain on the rules-based international order. This is, of course, the rules, the norms, the principles, the multilateral institutions, financial organizations, security alliances, all put in place at the end of World War II in the wake of a 50-year period that saw 2 world wars and the Great Depression. And these were designed to prevent the recurrence of those kinds of events. For all of their shortcomings, these organizations, institutions, norms, and principles have served the world reasonably well. But now they are under enormous strain, enormous stress by countries, again, that would like to see changes to these. Again, China in particular. Some of its desires are entirely legitimate and reasonable. Some others, frankly, are more debatable. But that system, again, is under unprecedented strain and stress, and that is another strategic context about which we need to be very concerned. And then finally, there's, particularly on a bad day in Washington, a dysfunction in DC that is preventing our country from taking advantage of 4 great revolutions that we are leading: the IT revolution, the manufacturing revolution, the energy revolution, and the life sciences revolution. The President Emeritus mentioned that I taught at the Honors College of the City University of New York every single week for 3.5 years until the travel that I have with KKR just made that impossible to continue. But that course was titled The North American Decades. It essentially describes a world that has followed the American century but is not yet the Asian or the Chinese century. It is the North American decades. And I used to explain to the students that the number of S's on those decades, the number of years that this would continue, would depend on the ability of those in Washington in particular, but also in state and local governments, but especially our nation's capital, to turn legislative, regulatory, and policy headwinds into tailwinds so that the country could fully capitalize on the opportunities in those four great revolutions. And the students had to write policy papers about how to, again, reduce some of these or resolve some of these legislative hurdles, these policy challenges, these regulatory issues. Some of these papers were so good, they wrote them as if they were agency heads or department secretaries. Two were so good that I actually sent them to the White House Chief of Staff. They wrote them to me as if I was the Chief of Staff, and two I actually forwarded on to Dennis McDonough, President Obama's Chief of Staff at the time. They did better, candidly, in many respects than those we've elected in Washington, who have been mired in such partisan politics that we've been unable to resolve the major issues of the day, the need for education reform and preparation of the workforce that is required for the future, in which there will be much greater automation, robotics, three-dimensional printing, and so forth. Coming to grips with immigration reform, a legal pathway for those who are needed in our agriculture and hospitality and other industries, more visas for the intelligent, the H-1B visas who are so desperately needed out in Silicon Valley where I was earlier this week, and then indeed what to do about those who are the so-called illegal aliens on our soil who have lived here for many, many years, and their status needs to be resolved as well. What about infrastructure investment, something that you all have come to grips with very, very much? I mean, it is the investment in your infrastructure and in all the buildings in what was a city that had hit rock bottom that is bringing you back. How to do that for the entire country, especially in places where that infrastructure is certainly not that of the world's leading economy. These issues, hugely important, must be grappled with, but right now are not being dealt with, unfortunately, because of the dysfunction in our capital, and again, at a time when we are in an era of renewed great power rivalries. Let me end then with the third topic, which is the 5 lessons that I think we should have learned from the past 16 years of war with Islamist extremists. The first of these is that we must recognize that ungoverned spaces in the Muslim world will be exploited by Islamist extremists. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when and how bad will it be. Will it be North Africa? Will it be Iraq? Syria, which is a geopolitical Chernobyl, a meltdown of a country, spewing violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but all the way into the countries of Western Europe, our NATO allies, causing that kind of domestic populism that I referred to as one of the challenges that the world faces right now. Something has to be done about this. That is the second lesson. You cannot do what we have occasionally tried to do in Washington, which is admire the problem until it goes away. That does not work. You must do something, however reluctant we may be, and indeed, given the costs of the wars in Iraq and Syria, that reluctance is entirely understandable. No one, I assure you, understands the cost of those wars more than the individual who is privileged to command the surge in Iraq and the surge in Afghanistan, and who wrote more letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers than I think any other commander on the battlefield in recent decades. But we have to do something about it. Las Vegas rules, unfortunately, do not apply in these places that are being exploited by Islamist extremists. What happens there does not stay there. Rather, it tends to spew these different challenges, not just into neighboring countries, but even further. The third lesson is that in doing something, typically the U.S. is going to have to lead the coalition of countries that help the host nation or the host nation forces to confront the extremists who are tearing apart their countries. I emphasize coalition. We should have a coalition. By the way, that coalition should include Muslim countries. As I mentioned earlier, this is more a fight for the heart of the Muslim world than it is actually a fight between the Muslim and other worlds. This is a clash within a civilization, therefore, more than it is a clash of civilizations, to hearken back to Harvard professor Sam Huntington's book of that title. But the U.S. must lead. We have the capabilities that dwarf those of all of the other countries put together, especially when it comes to the critical enabling tools, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms that we can put into the sky, an armada of Predators and Reaper drones, each of which has 150 people just doing all of the piloting, the payload operating, the arming, fueling, fixing, communications architecture, and most importantly, the analysis of the signals intelligence, the imagery intelligence, the measurement intelligence, and all the rest, and then integrating all of that in a way that the U.S. does so much better than any other country in the world. So we are going to have to lead in most cases, but we do want to do it with a coalition. And as I will mention later, we want to do it in support of host nation forces rather than having to do it for them, for a very key reason that I'll explain shortly. The fourth lesson is that we have to acknowledge that you cannot counter terrorists like the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or others with just counter-terrorist force operations. You can't just drone strike or Delta Force raid your way out of this problem. Those are necessary, don't get me wrong, but you also have to conduct a whole host of other operations. But ideally, doing it in support of host nation forces so that when you have this comprehensive approach, which has all of the elements of the comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign that Ambassador Ryan Crocker and I led during the surge in Iraq, that the bulk of those tasks are not performed by our men and women in uniform and coalition forces and diplomats and development workers, but by those of the host nation themselves. And to the credit, in fact, of our men and women on the battlefield, the previous administration, however reluctant they may have been to get back into Iraq and to go into Syria, we've been able to figure out how to do that. And this administration has capitalized on that and then improved on it by providing modest additional resources, pushing decision-making authorities down, and removing some of the restrictions and some of our key capabilities, including our air power and support of our partners on the battlefield. But it does have to be a comprehensive campaign, but in support of those in that country rather than our young men and women doing it for them. And that is crucial because of lesson number 5, and that is that we are in a generational struggle. This is not a war that we are going to be able to find the right hill, take the hill, plant the flag, and go home to a victory parade. This is never going to be a reprise of Desert Storm, unfortunately. This is going to be a struggle of decades, not a decade, much less a few years, and we are going to have to keep at it. We need, therefore, a sustained commitment. But as you all know, the only way to sustain a commitment is to ensure that the cost is sustainable. Sustainability is measured quite simply in the expenditure of blood and treasure, of lives and of dollars. And if we can keep that to a relative minimum, then I think it is possible to have the kind of sustained commitment that I do believe is necessary. Clearly, we could not sustain the 165,000 Americans in uniform that I was privileged to command during the surge, along with another tens of thousands of coalition forces and 170,000 contractors. That is just not feasible. It was necessary at the time, a courageous decision at the time, the right decision at that time, but certainly not something that could be sustained. It did keep that country from descending into all-out civil war and truly going up in flames. And for those who wonder what might have happened to Iraq had we just let it, quote, break into Sunnistan, Shiistan, and Kurdistan, just look to the west at what happened to Syria as that country sought to break itself up and erupted into civil war. where half the population of that country has been displaced internally or externally. Half of that half is actually outside the country, and the cost in lives has been absolutely staggering. So we must sustain this. It must be sustainable, and I think we actually have figured out how to do that. So those were the three key topics that I wanted to address to set the stage for the discussion that we'll have with the journalists. Again, that we are back in an era of great power rivalries, that the number of threats to our security and that of our Western democratic allies and partners is quite complex, arguably more complex than at any time since the end of the Cold War, and that there are some very important lessons we should have learned from the wars since 9/11. With that, as I often end my speeches, let me say, go Army, beat Navy, go Warriors, beat Grand Valley. Thank you.
I'll have to find out why they're not mic'd. They need to be mic'd.
There we go. There we go. There's a microphone. Okay. So thank you so much.
Just before we get started, Carol, I just want to mention, first of all, thank you very much, General Patraeus. You really deserve another round of applause. We really appreciate it. And to the audience, I want to say you've been given some cards, and if you think of questions, let me just ask that you make them short and that you print them, and they'll be collected at the end of the hour. We'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. Thank you. With that, Carol and Chuck, please.
Thank you. So, General, thank you for giving us your outline and sticking to your very disciplined speech. This is a first, and congratulations on it. Really interesting things. It is so nice to be here. Before we dive in, I want to give a shout out to Eugene Applebaum, who I interviewed many times through the years, a trailblazer. He has done so many wonderful things I know he's missed, but Dr. Reed, thank you for this speaker series, which is amazing, and I'm so glad to be here with the top draw with General Petraeus. It's an honor to be here with you, sir. And I'm also honored to be here with the iconic Chuck Stokes of WXYZ, who...
Checks in the mail. Thank you. Thank you, Carol. It is indeed a pleasure to sit next to one of my favorite colleagues. We worked together for many, many years, and no one could be prouder of what she has accomplished in this city than I am. And General Petraeus, thank you so much for coming to Detroit and experiencing, even though I know you're on a tight schedule, a little bit of the renaissance that we're undercurring right now, and hopefully you'll have a chance to go up and down Woodward a little bit before they put you back on a plane. And thank you, most of all, for bringing us a little sun. I understand you flew in from Arizona, so obviously you brought a little bit of it with you, so we appreciate it, considering the fact that we had snow earlier in the week. Let me begin. You clearly talked about the hot spots in the world, and we have a lot of hot spots. And we live in interesting times, which are changing sometimes daily, sometimes hourly, and sometimes just with a social media tweet. But I'm curious to know, we just appropriated the largest military budget in history. That in the backdrop of a federal deficit that is huge and is growing seemingly every year. Do you agree with what we have just appropriated? Is that necessary to keep us secure at home and abroad? And are we being militarily responsible and fiscally responsible?
You have just violated the one question mark per question rule that we discussed backstage. So let me address that. Look, I have long been a proponent of additional spending for defense. Beyond that, actually, I was a huge proponent of just not having sequestration in the middle of a fiscal year hit the Department of Defense and other budgets like a hammer and require unprogrammed massive cuts that have all kinds of very negative effects, particularly on the readiness of our armed forces, because generally they fence procurement. You can't stop procurement because you pay a penalty. They fence military personnel, so you can't lay people off. You end up laying off civilian workers, of which the department has a great number, but inevitably what you do is you ground the planes, you tie up the ships, and you park the tanks until the next fiscal year, unless you are at war or preparing to go to war. And that had the single biggest negative effect on our readiness when it took place about 3 years ago, I guess it was. And Jim Mattis, the current defense secretary, longtime friend, combat comrade, did the counterinsurgency field manual together and other endeavors. He's said correctly that that did more damage again to readiness than did the years of war, though we clearly have a lot of backlog in terms of vehicles and helicopters and planes that we need to work out of. Nonetheless, look, I think we should have spent more on defense. I'm glad that we have spent more. You can argue whether, how much is enough. Having said that, I am not at all a fan, as a former economics professor and now in the financial community, of the fact that with the tax reform or cuts package, that we are adding $1.5 trillion of additional deficit spending to what we already were going to spend. And then with the budget deal, we add another $1 trillion of spending, this is over the 10-year period generally, to what we would have spent. Obviously the deficit went up very considerably during the Great Recession to try to pull us out of it. That was started by President Bush, continued by President Obama. It was the right course of action to pursue. We came out of that recession faster than any of the other industrialized democracies in the world because we did do that. The EU couldn't do that. Countries didn't control their own currency in the Eurozone. The UK did to a degree, not as dramatically. So we came out of this. We've done very well. The country is great, and it still is great. It'll be great again. But we're 104 or 105 months into this current recovery. The economy is quite warm, if not hot. The Federal Reserve is concerned about rising inflation. We have 4.1% unemployment, which is the lowest in a very long period of time, probably going to go below 4% in the course of the months that lie ahead in this year. And at a time like that, theoretically, you should be running surpluses. In the past, that was the idea. You run surpluses in good times, and you run deficits in bad times. But now we are running very considerable surpluses, and they're going to be even more considerable as a result of that. It's not just because we're spending more on defense. I mean, this has to do with revenue, taxes and revenue, and it also has to do with some of the social spending that we do. One of the parties in our country can't abide anything that smacks of additional taxes, in fact wants to cut them, even at a time when the country is doing exceedingly well. And another party won't touch anything that has to do with social spending, even if that social spending is on folks like us who are doing relatively quite well, and my new friends on Wall Street and so forth, who even got a tax cut, except if you're in New York where you pay state taxes, which are no longer deductible. But in any event, this is the conundrum of our time. And you see a tiny bit of buyer's remorse already. The Republicans are already saying, many of them actually were elected because they were going to be the fiscal conservatives, and it turns out that they're the party in power that has overseen arguably the most enormous addition to our deficit spending at good times. Obviously, again, if you're in a recession, you got to come out of it and you do what you have to do, especially if it's the Great Recession as we experienced in late 2008, 2009. So that is a serious concern. There are comrades of mine, former Admiral Mullen, for example, great chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the 4 years, basically, during which I was at war, along with Secretary of Defense Gates, who I used to call him my Secretary of War. Admiral Mullen said this is the greatest threat facing our country. It certainly is one of the great threats, and now it has gotten greater. because of the amount of deficit spending that we are adding to already projected deficits. We need to get back to a period where the debt to GDP ratio is coming down, not going up. It has been doing that for the last probably 6 or 7 years, and that's heartening because you can see that eventually you can grow your way out of it. You're never going to just balance the budget, not even in a 10-year period. It's ludicrous to look at how you could do that. Anybody who has ever done a budget-cutting deal recognizes that right away. But you can gradually grow out of the deficit, but you've got to get that under control. And this is indeed a security threat because we also are going to have rising interest rates. That debt is going to cost more each year. It's going to become an increasing amount of our budget, which means that over time, it is going to crowd out defense spending and social spending and all spending on other programs as well. And this is why, indeed, Congress now is looking back and saying, gosh, maybe we need to now do a budget cutting drill, having done a budget spending drill already this year.
So in doing research about you, I do research with the paper, with CBS, looking online, talking to friends, some out in the audience here who have military backgrounds. Thank you for your questions, by the way. If you want to be blown away, go to Wikipedia and Google the general's name. It's incredible how many things that you have accomplished here.
Well, it was a war zone, you know. I mean, it was like, it was actually, I think it was the 7th or 8th Wikipedia site that was locked down because during the war years in particular, you know, one group would get on it and do the effective, you know, graffiti of a wiki site, and then allies would get on and make it overly positive.
It's impressive nonetheless. It's worth the visit.
Now it is adjudicated, apparently. So they tell me.
So you in your comments, you gave a wonderful outline of things to be concerned of. As a general, the former director of the CIA, what is the greatest threat, besides the budget deficit, and maybe that's your answer, but what else keeps you up at night thinking about the nation and the security of the United States today? If there was one thing, what would it be?
You know, I think it varies. I mean, needless to say, when you are a CIA director or a general or whatever commander, you get that question, what keeps you awake at night? I mean, the truth is now not much. I mean, except if I'm on a red-eye flight from San Francisco through Phoenix, and then it's coffee. But I think it really depends from day to day. Needless to say, right now, the North Korean nuclear threat is the one that's elevated on many days because it has the consequences of not getting that right could be very, very considerable. But you have that also with these other challenges that I mentioned. Something could go bump in the night in the South China Sea and it just escalates. And in fact, it's not even just those that involve the US. What about China and Japan getting into a shouldering match out at sea, as they call it, where the Chinese ships are trying to get to the Senkaku, which the Japanese claim and have control of, but the Chinese also claim, or the Diaoyu in their vernacular. And you have the number 2 and the number 3 economies of the world in some form of at least economic warfare. This has happened before. Chinese boycotted Japanese firms on the mainland. There's very considerable Japanese involvement in the Chinese economy. What would happen if there's violence against them? So again, you can see all of these different ways. There can be a miscalculation between Russia and one of our NATO partners, say in the Baltic states, the so-called smash and grab scenario, where Russia says, well, the ethnic Russian and Russian-speaking and Russian citizens of one of these Baltic countries said that they were being abused and we had to go in and protect them. I mean, it's as many as 30 or more % in some of the different Baltic states. That's the pretext. They go in and then they throw the so-called nuclear umbrella on top of that and your move, NATO. So these kinds of scenarios, I think, are very, very challenging. But the one that lurks in the background for me is the one that I explained in some detail, which is the threat in cyberspace, particularly against the industrial control systems that operate our electrical grid. I'm very, very concerned about that. There's a lot of analysis of this that shows the vulnerabilities of these. I'm actually a private venture capitalist as well and invested in way over a dozen startups. One of those is actually in that space, so I'm actually keenly aware of those vulnerabilities. By the way, it's an Israeli firm, interestingly, and one where I recognize the co-founders because it turned out that we had been doing something together when I was the CIA director, and one of them was in Mossad and the other was in what's called Unit 8200, which is the Israeli version of NSA. By the way, it was a great thrill this morning to be at the other DIA. They told me you were going to DIA. I said, no, I mean the Defense Intelligence Agencies in Washington. Far fewer security badges and lockout doors.
Detroit, as you know, has a very diverse community, and we have a new growing population with new immigrants. We also have this testy issue that we've been dealing with for quite some time of border security. The president recently announced that he would have National Guard patrol some of our southern borders. Even California, blue state with a very liberal governor, said yesterday that he will go along with that purely for the protection, not for the building of the wall. What is your thought in terms of whether or not this is an appropriate use of the military and it's a good use of the military, and what should their role be limited to?
Look, we already have military engaged in border security. There is a joint task force called JTF North, which was originally JTF 6, some in this room. I know there's at least one other West Point graduate in here who will remember that started decades ago. We have used military aircraft and even military on the ground over the years in a variety of different ways. In some cases, that has not turned out all that well. Keep in mind that the military doesn't have arrest powers inside the U.S. The rules of engagement are very limited. Remember, though, there was I think it was a U.S. Marine on the ground who shot and killed somebody who was actually a shepherd, herding, I think it was sheep or some other cattle in an incident on the border that was very, very highly publicized at that time. And I'm sure they're studying that incident as they train these troops to go out and augment those that are already there and to augment the border security. Look, I think using the military to augment, it's this called civil support. This is a task that we do provide in the United States. And, you know, it's a legitimate task. Again, we're already doing it, so this is an augmentation of what is already being overseen by Joint Task Force North out of Fort Bliss, Texas. We do it off the coast of Florida. There's military aircraft and so forth that are used for counter-narcotics and also counter-smuggling and some counter-immigration. You know, the question is, what's the optimum way to improve your security? This is a component. I remember, you know, I had my celebrity apprentice moment with President-elect Trump in Trump Tower when I was asked to come in and discuss possibly being the Secretary of State. And, you know, he had a list of questions in front of him that he wanted to ask, which I think were generally to determine, can this guy turn campaign slogans into policy? I had a list in front of me, by the way, that I wanted to determine, could I work for this individual on a host of key issues? In other words, are we substantively compatible to do that position? And so one of the questions he said, so General, should we have a wall? And I said, of course we should have a wall, President-elect, where we don't have a wall already, where it will do some good as part of a comprehensive, overarching program to secure our borders and as part of, ideally, a comprehensive immigration program. Because as I mentioned during my remarks, we really need to come to grips with the issues of legal pathway for unskilled workers who are hugely important to a number of industries in the United States, foremost among them agriculture, hospitality, and in many cities and states, construction. We need to come to grips with the 12 or more million people on our soil who are not citizens of the United States and are here technically illegally, including, again, the DACA children. And we've got to figure out how can we get more smart people in by raising the H-1B visa, but do it in a way that doesn't make this a convenient way for firms to displace American workers and pay less for those coming from other countries. So these are all part and parcel of this big issue. And you know, one of the truisms of life, I think, is that just as I said, you have to have a comprehensive approach to counter Islamist extremists, you generally have to have a comprehensive approach to address everything. There are as we get older in life, we tend to glom onto this one issue. You know, if we just solved this, everything else would turn out great. It doesn't. It's usually a multi-factor equation, and you've got to do a number of things. In Detroit, you know, where do you start if you have a city that is just crumbled at its core? Do you start with policing, with security? Do you start with urban renewal, with rebuilding? Do you start with economic revival? Do you start with restoration of basic services? As always, it takes all of the above. Education, one that still obviously, as everyone here has noted very forthrightly, still needs to be addressed. So that's how I would answer that question when it comes to border security in the greater context, again, of really controlling access to our country. By the way, I would just add as well that as CI director, as a general, whatever, my concern was frankly not with refugees coming to our country who want to blow themselves up. Don't get me wrong, you need to screen for that very carefully, but the process of coming to the United States as a refugee, particularly from some of the war-torn countries, is so tortuous. Because I got into it at times. There were translators that I personally knew who had put their lives on the line and their families' lives on the line, and they needed a general officer letter of recommendation, and I gave that, and then I would follow up, and 2.5 years later, they still hadn't even had an interview in Amman, Jordan, or something like that, or they were stymied, and so on. The concern about who's going to come in here, if it's really from the outside to carry out terrorist acts, is just tourist visas. I mean, it's not that hard to get, if you really want to be a terrorist, it is not hard to get into this country by means other than being a refugee. The last thing you're probably going to do is actually come as a refugee, because that's a long, long boat to the United States.
So, General, inquiring minds want to know. You raised the issue, so I have a follow-up question too. When you were sitting with President-elect Trump and you were talking about Secretary of State, and at that moment it did not work out, would you consider, maybe not Secretary of State, another position in this administration? Or if the opportunity arose, would that be a notion you might entertain?
Look, I feel very, very fortunate to be doing what I am doing. I've worked very hard over the past 5 years to build this sort of new life in the civilian realm, to be a partner in KKR. They don't do charity, and I mean, they do charity, but not with partnerships. It's an extraordinary firm. We have $185 billion under management around the world. We invest in companies, we help them grow, we provide expertise, not just capital. To have all these different academic endeavors, to these different startup investments, frankly, the speaking circuit, the highest form of white-collar crime in America. The idea of giving all that up is pretty difficult for me at this point in time, frankly.
Do you think that the president has demoralized the intelligence community? And if so, what can be done about it? Or do you think that what he has said is right on target, and the CIA and the FBI and other intelligence agencies are out of control?
Well, I don't think he said that the intelligence community is out of control. I think he has questioned some of their assessments, which at the end of the day, I think shouldn't be questioned. I mean, there's no question that the Russians intervened and undermined our faith in our elections, in the democratic system, sought to pour gas on burning embers, whether it's debates in Facebook or other internet social media platforms, and indeed, I think, tried at least. I don't know whether it was decisive or not, because again, it was a multilateral equation that resulted in the election of Donald Trump as president, but certainly tried to put a finger on the scales of that particular election. Beyond that, I think the intelligence community is quite solid. I know obviously still many friends that are in the CIA and at DNI and these other locations. They're professionals. They are true professionals, just like the military, and they keep their head down and they move forward. The challenges on the law enforcement side, a bit more substantial, I think. I think they also, however, are true professionals. They just keep their head down and they know their lane. This is not partisan activity that's going on. I don't believe. It is individuals who have been appointed by Republicans and appointed by Democrats, and we need to let that system work, as Senator McConnell and Speaker Ryan and others have all said, and to see what the outcome of that is.
So I know we agreed we would only ask one question at a time. Mine's a two-part, but it's an easy two-part. I'm curious.
Journalists are absolutely
pushing the boundaries. That's what we're here to do.
They're genetically incapable of asking a single question.
This is what my parents told me. My parents did say that, but they also were journalists, so they got it too. So with that said, I'm curious your quick thoughts on Syria, number one. And our president has been involved with Twitter diplomacy and is tweeting to Russia about military action in Syria. I'm curious about your thoughts of conversing this way.
Well, look, I have said on a number of occasions publicly that clearly message discipline has not been one of the hallmarks of this administration. I generally think it should be, and generally that, and obviously in a position where we were putting out press statements on many, many occasions, not to mention stepping up to the podium at various points along the way. Indeed, there was a period where I ended up, I had to be, I recognized it, whether I wanted to or not, to be the face of the surge. Most others have been discredited or a bit sidelined, and so you have to do that. And when we did do that, we tried first, number one was what we called to be first with the truth, to step up to the podium, and if it was a horrible day, we said we had a terrible day. And this is what took place, this is what we'll do in the future, this is what we learned from it, this is what we'll do in the future to mitigate the risk of this happening again. But again, there will undoubtedly be more tough days. So again, I think there's a lot of value, even with individuals who may think that they have exactly the right idea on what to inject into the debate of the day, to have others look at it, to have folks with fresh eyes, a bit detachment, and so forth, to look at something and to pause, metaphorically speaking, to pause before hitting the send key. Second, the thoughts on Syria. We're way past the point where we might have done something to operationalize President Obama's statement that Bashar al-Assad must go, the murderous dictator of Syria. That is not an option at this point in time. He certainly has to be, and his forces have to be punished for what they did in using, yet again, lethal chemical weapons on their own people. And I applauded when President Trump did take that action a year or so ago in response. And I winced a bit, frankly, when the red line that was declared in the previous administration turned out not to be a red line, even though the removal of some, what now turns out to be 90%, certainly not 100% as was stated at the time, removal of, say, 90% of the chemical weapons from Syria without having to shoot was a good outcome. At this point in time in Syria, I think the objective that we have, in addition to finishing the defeat of the Islamic State and then making sure that we keep them down, which means that you have to have a continued presence, albeit perhaps a smaller one than we have at this point in time. But you've also then got to help those on the ground, help, not do, in a whole variety of different ways with that comprehensive approach that I mentioned before, because if you don't help them restore basic services, if you don't help them, encourage them to reestablish local governance, if you don't help them rebuild dispute mechanisms, resolution mechanisms, and so forth, if all of that isn't done, you're going to be right back fighting again, and it will give the kinds of reason for citizens in those regions to once again perhaps welcome the Islamic State back as an antidote to the perhaps highly sectarian activities of those in charge. We are not going to again roll back the advances of Bashar al-Assad, but we certainly can help those that we've been assisting and enabling on the ground to hang on to what they have and to use that as an enormous amount of leverage because that's where the oil fields of eastern Syria are, and to use that as leverage so the United States has a significant amount of influence in what will inevitably be at some point in time a political resolution to Syria. I don't know if Syria can actually be put back together again. I don't know if this Humpty Dumpty truly can be re-glued back together, or whether it should be, or what the arrangement should be, how much autonomy for those that we're currently assisting, who have obviously been fighting against not just the Islamic State, which we want, but also against, in some cases, the forces of Bashar al-Assad or some of the others in the country, noting that Bashar al-Assad would have been toppled were it not first for the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force, then for Lebanese Hezbollah being brought in from southern Lebanon under the guidance of the Quds Force, then Shia militias from outside the region in some cases or in the region, funded, trained, equipped, and directed by Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force, and then finally Russian air power and special operations. All of these are in that mix, which also includes huge Turkish interests because of their concern about the Kurdish Turks, but also the Kurdish Syrians. So you can see the complexity of this particular situation, and I think you have to have measured aspirations. And perhaps the biggest goal there right now, and again, in addition to finishing the defeat of the Islamic State, curbing the ability of Iran to connect, again, Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, and southern Lebanon with this Shia crescent, but also, frankly, stop the bloodshed, allow the return of some refugees at the least, if not as many as is possible, and then help them rebuild the parts of the country that at least we are helping to oversee.
General, this will be the last question that you'll get from me and Carol, and then we'll go to questions from students in the audience. I believe it was Teddy Roosevelt that said, walk softly and carry a big stick. Not too long ago, President Trump, in talking about Russia, said no one has been tougher on Russia than Donald Trump. General McMaster said we have failed to impose sufficient cost. Which one is right, and what do you make of President Trump's relationship with President Putin?
Well, it's hard to know what are the issues that underlie all of this. Clearly, the administration has gotten tougher and tougher and tougher. Certainly, one of the reasons for that is another branch of our government that has much more influence over American foreign policy than people actually realize. Unlike a parliamentary democracy, where the chief executive, the prime minister, generally controls the parliament, has a majority in the parliament, or at least a coalition majority in the parliament. In this case, the president of the United States, even if his own party's in power, may have certain actions forced on him, and Congress rightly has pursued sanctions on Russia that the president was reluctant to sign, but had to because it was a veto-proof majority, just as, frankly, the Congress did on Iran when President Obama was trying to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal. Didn't welcome those, but actually ended up probably helping the negotiation because Iran realized that if it didn't sign, this was going to get tougher and tougher and tougher. So again, Congress has helped with this, certainly, but the executive branch has, over time, again, including the latest round of sanctions on these oligarchs and powerful individuals right around Vladimir Putin himself. And so gradually, I think they have gotten to that. Why it has taken the amount of time that it has, why the Treasury was slow for a while to do what Congress had directed them to do, again, hard to say. But at the end of the day, I'm very, very pleased to see that there is a good bit more being done, because I generally feel, as with General McMaster, very, very close colleague of mine, someone who was very instrumental in a lot that we did in the surge in Iraq, the surge in Afghanistan, and even U.S. Central Command when I was the commander. Again, I think that he is right that we had not, at that point in time, that we had not done enough against Russia, who very clearly, without question, took serious actions, again, as I mentioned, to undermine our most sacred of institutions, our democratic foundations.
So at this point, we are so proud to talk about Wayne State University's nationally acclaimed Journalism Institute for Media Diversity, which is continuing to train high-achieving students for careers in media. There's over 150 graduates from the Institute working at Metro Dailies, radio and TV station, PR firms, and other media organizations around the nation. And we're so pleased to have a student and a graduate of the program with us today to start off to ask a question as well. And I'm going to ask them to stand as I introduce them. Aliana Sayakan, is that correct? Okay. She is a senior at Wayne State University pursuing degrees in print and digital journalism, political science, and history. She's a member of the Journalism Institute for Media Diversity, the Irving D. Reed Honors College, and currently works as an intern at the Detroit Free Press, my alma mater, where I also write a column. And I know she's going to ask a question, and so do you want to ask your question first?
All right. Is this on?
Is it working?
It is working, but you're going to have to
as long as you can hear me, that's good.
You're going to have to get close to it.
Alrighty. Are we good? Well, thanks so much for coming here and talking to us, General Petraeus. The question I want to ask is, over the years, we've seen extremists and terrorists and hate groups in the United States of America use social media to spread their message and also propaganda. And attached to that, we've also seen how integral social media was during the Arab Spring as we saw those people mobilize. And more recently, we see our President of the United States often use Twitter to speak on issues of national and international concern. Do you think that social media has become a point of national security? And how has the rise of social media affected how the defense and intelligence departments work in the United States to keep us safe?
Yes, and it has affected it greatly. Okay, look, I have, again, for quite some time, contended that social media needed to do a vastly better job at eliminating, in particular, extremist content from platforms like YouTube, Facebook, other internet service provider, Google, and so forth. And the reason is, you know, if you really look at the terrorist threats that we've faced in the United States and most of the terrorist incidents in the United States, generally these actually are not immigrants. They are generally self-recruited U.S. citizens. And the way they self-recruit often, certainly they are feeling alienated, obviously more than disgruntled, perhaps depressed, a whole bunch of other issues. And they go online and they can find, as an example, the sermons of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was actually a U.S. citizen. He was an American colloquial English speaker, but also Yemeni, I believe, because that's where he went after the United States. Hugely charismatic, handsome in an, again, Arab kind of way with a great beard and tall and handsome, but a very, very effective speaker, except that it was very much extremist hate speech and inciting to violence and trying to stimulate violence. He was killed in Yemen back in September of 2011, along with an individual who was the editor of what was called Inspire magazine. And the irony is that you could find these sermons of Anwar al-Awlaki. Last year, we did a search. You could find them more easily last year on YouTube, I think it was, than you could the year before. That is just flat wrong. I actually think that there has to be legislation on this issue. I tend to think there probably should be legislation on a number of the issues that have been raised in the last 2 days of testimony by Congress with the founder of Facebook. These are very, very serious issues, particularly, again, the extremist content, the incitement to violence. Now, I get it. It's much more difficult for machines, and again, it's machines that have to do this. It's going to be a form of machine learning, artificial intelligence, to determine where does free speech end and incitement to violence begin than it is to identify child pornography, which was made illegal and generally has been removed by and large from the general internet. It's certainly available, I'm sure, on the dark web. But we have to see better work done on that. I have been pushing this for a considerable period of time. I was part of a study by an organization in the UK, the Policy Exchange, a think tank, which looked at this and proposed for the UK legislation. I'm hopeful that when Prime Minister May said enough is enough in the wake of one of their domestic terrorist incidents, that will lead to legislation. They're understandably a bit preoccupied with this thing called Brexit. But at some point in time, I think they will move ahead. That may be the example for us, noting that we're a much more complex, much larger, much more difficult country in some of these respects. So, look, I think there has to be more done, and I think what has been done clearly is inadequate so far.
And we have a question from Chris Ehrman. Chris, will you take to the podium, please? He's a graduate of Wayne State University with a degree in broadcast journalism and the international studies. He graduated from the Journalism Institute for Media Diversity and currently works as a multimedia journalist and documentary filmmaker at the News Times in Newport, Oregon. So, Chris, your question.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to it. It's an honor just to have this discussion. My question is, I would like to go back to the history aspect of it because I think it's very interesting that you mentioned, that you said history is back, it's coming back, and I think that's very interesting when it comes to, you mentioned North Korea and Russia pushing the envelope, and we see a lot of Western countries, like you said, Marie Le Pen gaining 35% of the vote in France. My question is, do you think the world is going back to a isolationist, pre-World War II nationalistic view of the world? And if you do think so, or if you don't think so, what are the dangers to that? And also, in addition to that, the world is very interconnected now. Is that possible to do that? So,
it's probably certainly not as possible as it was, again, in the past, although you can actually go back in history and look at how connected the world was actually before, I think it was World War I. And so we've obviously had these periods before. There was obviously the isolationism of the 1930s. In fact, many economists will argue that one of the catalysts for the Great Depression, not the only one by any means, was, I think it was Smoot-Hawley, which was a set of tariffs, which started out to be very focused, and then as every congressman and every senator added, his own pet to the tariff pool, ended up being quite comprehensive and had a very stifling effect at a very fragile time for the U.S. and the global economy, and then was a factor, again, in plunging the world into the Great Recession, which lasted for really almost an entire decade. Do we see this coming again? Look, there's a lot of anti-globalist forces out there. There are also some anti-globalist developments. The fact is, by the way, not little-known fact in some places in Washington, manufacturing is back in the United States. It has been coming back. We are actually at the all-time high in manufacturing output in the U.S. The problem is that while it has gone like that, again, since the Great Recession, manufacturing employment has gone about like that. It actually went down a tiny bit and then up a little bit. And why? Because robotics, automation. We're replacing people doing repetitive tasks with machines. And that means you can actually bring back manufacturing to countries, which is, again, not anti-globalism as an emotion. It's just anti-globalism because you don't have to pay for expensive workers here, which is the reason why it was outsourced or offshored to begin with. So now it's onshoring and insourcing in a number of different cases. So you have that kind of development as well. You also have an enormous advantage in product refinement and development, if you can do it much closer to the engineers who generally oversee this, tend to be here in the United States, where we were building overseas. If you bring that manufacturing back and do it right here, you can do much more. You know, it used to be a washing machine, a white good would be updated, I don't know, every few years or something like that. Now there's constant tweaks to these, and it's going to get ever more constant because next is going to be three-dimensional printing, so you can tweak it any which way you want, and you'll have it actually at the corner store where you can just send your design down there, they print it, you pick it up and bring it home. These kinds of dynamics, I think, are very, very interesting when you look at what the effect will be on globalism. And then you have the anti-globalist sentiment. And by the way, there is something to this. You know, we generally, when you pass trade deals, what happens is the trade folks, the executive branch and the legislative branch tend to focus on the fact that the overall population is going to benefit from this. We're all going to pay much less for blue jeans, sneakers, cars, whatever it may be, because they're going to be produced overseas by, again, lower cost labor. And you tend to overlook the fact that if you have NAFTA, it could result in an end to the apparel industry in North Carolina, the shoe industry in New England, or what have you, which is, of course, what happened. Now, to be fair, in some cases, maybe it wasn't anticipated to be quite the extent that it turned out to be. But I think as you do trade deals, what you have to do is be very, very honest with the American people and say, look, this is an existential issue for this particular industry. We get it. And that's why Congress is going to allocate more TAA, trade adjustment assistance, for that particular sector. And it's going to be more than we've ever done before. And by the way, the duration of it is going to be longer. And here are the programs that we're going to do so that when these people are no longer making shoes in New England, we're going to help them move into another industry, another pursuit. And if they can't do that, we're going to be with them for life. That's the kind of approach that has to be taken, rather than just playing on, again, the fears and the reality of what took place. Again, populism starts with something. You can argue that it is then played upon too much, and the fears are stoked and so forth, which then does result in, as I said, the domestic populist pressures that we've seen in so many different countries. And keep in mind, again, it's not just trade. It is, of course, illegal immigration, legal immigration, refugee flows, and all the rest. And we've seen what that does, and so therefore that we do have to take lessons from that. But I would hope, actually, that we would continue to support globalism, and that most importantly, the United States would continue to recognize that there are benefits for our country by continuing to lead the rules-based international order. And keep in mind as well that if we do not lead that rules-based international order, there are other countries that would love to lead that. In fact, we had this paradoxical situation last January where President Xi Jinping of China was making the Davos speech, the World Economic Forum speech, in the same week that Prime Minister May gave the hard Brexit speech and President Trump gave the America First inaugural address. And so again, China would be happy to step into the leadership role. The question is, would the rules remain the same? Would they be as benevolent as we think they are under our stewardship, or would they indeed change?
General, we have a lot of questions here. We'll try to get through as many as we can from our audience, and I think they cover a wide range of topics here. This one is submitted by Don Sherman, and he wanted to know, recent accidents in the Navy and Air Force seem to point to a lack of training and maintenance. I'm sorry, put it down.
I was wondering how
Shame
you were
on
doing
me.
that.
A broadcast person forgetting his mic is sitting there. All right, let's start again. We have a lot of questions here. This one is from Don Sherman. He said, recent accidents in the Navy and Air Force seem to point to a lack of training and maintenance of our existing troops and equipment. How would you propose that these issues be addressed?
I think that certainly has been a factor, and a part of that is what I described earlier, which was the sequestration that imposed these cuts. And as I mentioned, the biggest impact of sequestration is to reduce readiness. And that means readiness for your actual tasks in combat, but it's also what you do in training. It is sailing of ships, navigation of ships, which was shown to be in a couple of these cases inadequate seamanship, essentially, and the practice of policies and standing operating procedures. Again, you don't get enough flight hours. You don't get to roll the tanks enough. You have to do that. Simulations do not quite get you there, to put it mildly, as important as they can be in helping to maintain skills. At the end of the day, you've got to get in the air, get at sea, and get out into the ranges in training so that you are ready for combat, and also that you reduce the number of accidents. Look, this is a dangerous endeavor regardless. I mean, it's reasonably well known that, you know, I actually took a bullet of an M16 round right through the chest. Thankfully, it was over the A in Petraeus rather than the A in Army. And I mean, a lot of people have accused me that I just really wanted to meet Dr. Bill Frist, who I absolutely knew was going to be a senator and the Senate Majority Leader, that I was dying to meet Bill Frist. He did save my life. Look, this is inherently dangerous. There are going to be some accidents, and there will be some loss of life, but this is, you know, we lost more to accidents last year than we did to combat. Now, it's great that we weren't losing that many in combat. It obviously is not when it comes to the loss in accidents. How do you combat that? You provide sufficient funds for readiness. You provide the training, the flight hours, the hours at sea, and the miles on your tanks.
Follow up to the military preparedness and talking about women in the military, particularly active duty. Your thoughts about that?
Look, I have been essentially a proponent of the idea that I really don't care about the gender, the orientation, or whatever, as long as they adhere to standards. And there are certain standards. And again, for a ranger school, for example, you know, it took quite a while before the Army had the guts to allow a woman to go to ranger school. It took quite a while for the Army to find a woman who could make it through ranger school. But inevitably, as I think we all knew, sooner or later you're going to find some women who can do the required, whatever it is, 8 pull-ups and run 5 miles in under 40 minutes and shoulder a rucksack for many, many tough miles and endure all the other challenges, again, of a very, very physical course that is also the best leadership course in the Army. So again, it always has just come down to standards. And again, it was one reason I was not that concerned about doing away with don't ask, don't tell, as long as you, again, have standards. And by the way, our son, who, great young guy who went to MIT, brilliant kid, and decided on his own to go into ROTC his second year. He called us up and said, "Dad, I just wanted you to know I joined ROTC. I said, "What do you think?" I said, "Call your mother." And he said, I just called her. She said to call you. Anyway, but I mean, you know, and I remember asking, I was by that point in time, I think, a 4-star general out of Iraq, I think, but not yet in Afghanistan. He, by the way, did multiple tours in Afghanistan, including 6 months, during which I was the most senior commissioned officer in theater, and he was the most junior commissioned officer, a second lieutenant rifle platoon leader in the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and then went back with special ops. And now, by the way, is at business school, doing business in law school. Great kid. But I remember asking him, I said, you know, is your generation concerned about this? He said, no. I mean, there's standards, and, you know, again, you can't do this and you can't do that. And again, as long as you don't change the standards. The challenge has been at times pressure from on high that your dropout rate is too high in ranger school, or your dropout rate in, again, jump school or whatever. And then you start to shave the standards. Standards of physical, standards, again, exercise and leadership, and standards in other areas of discipline.
This is an issue that's being obviously debated all across the country. We want to know, what is your view on gun control policy, especially after the recent school shootings all across our nation?
I am a strong proponent of the Second Amendment, but I'm also one of those, along with Stan McChrystal, General McChrystal, and a number of others of my comrades from the battlefield years, who doesn't think that that necessarily means that we should allow anyone to buy a weapon that has one purpose and one purpose alone, and that is to kill a lot of fellow human beings, i.e. an assault weapon, to turn it into an automatic weapon with a bump stock, and to increase the lethality even more by allowing high-capacity magazines. So there's actually a common sense approach to some of this stuff, which includes, again, addressing those issues while still being fiercely protective of one's right to have a weapon, assuming that there has been sufficient background check and that those background checks are extended to these, quote, loopholes such as gun shows and the rest.
Interesting question here. Is class warfare the leading driving force of this new global struggle for power?
Well, I don't know if it's class warfare. Certainly that is undoubtedly one of the factors in conflict in some societies where you have enormous haves and enormous have-nots, and that results not just in a clash in the domestic politics of such a country, but it ends up in actual violence against those who are in power. But there are many, many other factors, I think, as well. Again, there are ethnic components, there are sectarian components, there are tribal components, there are even political components, there are criminal components, all of these. And in some cases, you have a mix of all of the above, such as Afghanistan. And then even more challengingly, the headquarters, if you will, the bases for the major warring factions in the country are actually outside the country, and you can't even get to them, even if you had the military capability of doing so. So again, many factors that lead to conflict, to war, and so forth. And let's not overlook interstate warfare. And again, wars started by leaders, by nations, and so forth, because that's yet another huge factor here as well. And we've seen that with Russia invading South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia, Crimea and the Donbass, the southeastern region of Ukraine, and intimidating and flying next to and causing a variety of other issues, all just, again, from a much resurgent and much more aggressive Russia under Vladimir Putin.
Gerald, this is an interesting question and sort of echoes to a recent conversation I had with the local publisher of the Korean Weekly, who tried to explain to me kind of the point of view of North Korea. This is submitted by Theo Ressa. Hopefully I'm pronouncing the name correctly. It says, I feel that the current U.S. government is dismantling traditional roles of U.S. in directing the world. Don't you think then this legitimizes the need for non-nuclear nations to invest in nuclear weapons for self-defense?
Pretty much, yeah. Let me get at that, because again, that really is echoing what I said earlier. The traditional roles of America have been connected to, again, being the leader or among the leaders of the rules-based international order. And if indeed we do not continue to play the roles connected with that, it will certainly result in other countries moving into that, the space that we leave. These are, you cannot have a vacuum in these areas. Someone is going to move into it. In international politics, does abhor a vacuum. And so, yeah, I am concerned about that. Now, as it relates to North Korea, I don't know that our seeming ambivalence, and it's not, again, just President Trump, by the way, it's other members of the government, it is sizable numbers of our population who have varying reservations about whether we should continue to spend our blood and treasure in a variety of different military activities, whether we should continue to fund the United Nations and other multilateral organizations the way that we typically have in the past, whether we should continue with multilateral trade deals or just go to bilateral, on and on and on. And all of these are legitimate issues for discussion and should cause certain policy adjustments as if we do continue to pursue what it is that we traditionally have, which I do believe we should do, because again, if we don't, I can assure you that someone else will.
As someone who has excelled in the military and in business, how do leaders inspire? What advice would you give? There's a lot of young people here too in the audience who are looking at future careers. How do you inspire people?
Well, let me actually first just offer a caveat to some of what I have said, because I don't want people to think that I am some kind of new Cold Warrior or, celebrating the fact that there are this new return of history and a new competition between different systems, while noting that the two countries principally engaged in that are actually their #1 trading partners. So again, what I do think the United States should do is determine when the issues really are important, and then to demonstrate firmness, not provocation. And I think at times, in recent administrations, not just the previous one, but others as well, we have been a bit hesitant. We have been perhaps a bit indecisive at critical moments, and that has sent a message that was not of firmness. And then you have aggressive countries like Vladimir Putin's Russia that will keep on pushing until they run up against something that is firm. Again, the question is, how can you have a response that is firm but not provocative? And I think that is the challenge. How do leaders inspire? Gosh, you provide an example, you give energy, you lead from the front. We had this saying, it's hard to lead from the rear of the formation. You demonstrate, if you will, mastery or understanding or competence at the various tasks in which you are leading organizations. I mean, at the strategic level, there are 4 crucial tasks that you have to get right. And by the way, if you don't get these right, you can be the most inspirational cheerleader in the world, you're not going to be a great leader. There's 4 tasks very quickly. It's to get the big ideas right, to get the strategy right. It is to communicate the big ideas effectively throughout the breadth and depth of the organization. It's to oversee the implementation of the big ideas of the strategy, and it is formally, you can't just do it informally, it's to formally determine how to refine the big ideas and do it all over again and again and again. In the surge in Iraq, I've often noted that the surge that mattered most was not the surge of forces. It wasn't the addition of 25 or 30,000 additional American men and women in uniform to an existing force of 140,000 or so. That wouldn't predict that you would drive violence down by 85% as we did in 18 months of the surge. What did that was the surge of ideas. That was the surge that mattered most. And those ideas, the strategy, were 180 degrees different from what we were doing in the year leading up to the surge. We were actually pulling out of the neighborhoods. We were consolidating on big bases, quote, getting out of the faces of the people, as if we were part of the problem. Look, the only way to secure the people, especially when the host nation forces no longer can handle the level of violence, as was increasingly apparent during 2006 leading up to the surge that started in early February 2007, the only way to secure the people is to live with them. And that was a huge, big idea. And so we went back into the neighborhood, 77 additional locations just in the greater Baghdad area alone. And we had to fight for most of those. And as I told Congress, it's going to get worse before it gets better, and it did. But then it's going to get better, and it did that as well. So again, you've got to get the big ideas right. By the way, this is very true in business. As I was mentioning at the other DIA this morning, in response to questions from some students, look at Netflix. Reed Hastings is one of the great innovators in the world, not just in America. Netflix has reinvented itself at least 4 times now, starting with, we're going to put Blockbuster out of business because we're going to mail CDs, movies to customers rather than have brick and mortar. That's the big idea. Communicate it. Now, there's lots of others, and there's lots of other little steps, but communicate that through the organization, figure out how to operationalize that, oversee it, get down here formally, and I've talked to him about this. He has formal sessions where they sit down and say, how do we need to refine our strategy? And he sits down and they say, well, this has been fantastic. Blockbuster's out of business, but now everybody else is in our business, so what do we do now? Well, we will have them download content So we'll have broadband speeds are fast enough now. So that's the new big idea, communicate it, figure out how to do it, oversee the implementation, get down here. Awesome, you know, we're bigger than ever, but now everybody else is downloading content too. What do we do now? To provide our own content, develop our own content. $100 million on House of Cards alone, one of the greatest investments of recent years. Do that all the way through, get down here. What do we do now? Everybody else is developing content. Well, now we're going to go after the blockbuster movie business. And they actually start putting out, and they've done well in Cannes and the Academy Awards and everything else. The first one, I wasn't a huge fan. It was Brad Pitt portraying General McChrystal. Stan has a much better sense of humor than the wooden soldier that Brad Pitt played. I also was hoping Brad Pitt was going to hold out for my role at some point in time and something. Anyway, so, you know, how do leaders inspire? They perform the task of strategic leadership right, by the way. Anybody who wants to see more on this, there's a website at the Belfer Center of Harvard University. It's just Google at the Belfer Center website, Petraeus on strategic leadership. We spent one of the years that I've done my fellowship up there on building this strategic leadership website, which goes into much detail because there's all kinds of tactics, techniques, and procedures, which include descriptions of affirmative leadership, which is positive leadership. It includes preemptive praise. It includes, again, providing energy, you know, 2 o'clock in the morning energy, as we used to call it in the paratroop business. It's the example. It's all of this and a whole bunch of, again, suggestions about how to do that. But again, if you don't get the big ideas right, you can be the most inspirational person in the world, and it ain't going to work.
General, this last question from the audience is from Edward, I think it's Baik, B-A-I-K. Hopefully I'm not tearing up his last name. What do you think is the most efficient way to help the soldiers and veterans who are struggling mentally and their families because of their service?
I think the most efficient and really the most important action that can be taken for veterans in particular, and particularly those of this, what I think is accurately described as the new greatest generation, this generation of veterans who volunteered at a time of war in the post 9/11 period, knowing that when they raised their right hand and took an oath that they were going to be asked to go to war and perhaps to do it more than once. And they still volunteered. This is the 1% of the population that at any given time generally is in uniform. And for the several percent or more, 5 or more percent that has been in uniform, the veteran population, the best way, I think, to discharge what really isn't a sacred obligation, I think, of us to them, is to provide them a career opportunity, not just a job. By the way, KKR, again, the firm in which I'm privileged to be a partner, we have an initiative called Vets at Work, and our portfolio companies, the companies in which we're invested, way over 100, I think it's probably over 130 or 40, depending on your accounting rules, around the world, but especially in the United States, of course, we've put to work over 53,000 veterans and spouses, because we count them in this. That's another very important category. We believe that it is not only the right thing to do to hire veterans, it is the smart thing to do from a business perspective. The experience, the discipline, the expertise, all of this that veterans bring is very, very important. There are special ingredients there. But then recognize that because someone was a great rifle platoon leader or squad leader or what have you in the military, doesn't mean that he or she is necessarily going to be automatically a great foreman without training, education, mentoring, affiliation groups, if you will, for the veterans in that particular firm, all supported and encouraged. And so that's the difference between a job and a career, is that a career has upward mobility, it has real opportunity, and it is one where the firm is really investing in the individual, not just hiring him or her to do something that 20 years later will not be something, providing the kind of meaningful employment that we think that our veterans should have, deserve, and will make the most of.
General, as proof of your earlier statement that journalists always have to push it one last time, real quick one that you won't get us in time trouble because you can answer it with a simple yes or no.
You know that no speaker ever uses a yes or no.
Jamie wants to know, will you run for president?
Thank you very much, Jamie. No.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll save you from that one, General, if you'd like to respond. But again, thank you very much. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you so much, Carol. That this has been a very stimulating session, and we really appreciate your participating with it. General Patraeus, as you started out the morning, although you had no sleep, you have been stimulating to us then at breakfast, and you continue to throughout. And just to show you that just to ask him, could you please just give him another round of applause? But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just before we conclude, and I'll ask Chair of the Board, Sandra O'Brien, to join me here on stage. We have a number of first responders and military personnel who came to this presentation today, and I would just like to ask you to stand and so we can applaud you.
Sure.
Military personnel and first responders. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jack. I know. We really appreciate everything you do, and we particularly appreciate the time that you have taken to come here today. Sandra O'Brien, you're here.
Thank you. Just very quickly before you all leave, we couldn't, with a clean conscience, allow the general to come into our house without giving him a gift. Our mama raised us right. So I wanted to present Mr. Petraeus with a little bit of Wayne State swag. I won't make you put it on, but I do want you to hold it up. Thanks so much.
Go Warriors. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Okay.